I have also to report that only 70 tons were flown in today. Some of the Corps will exhaust bread supplies tomorrow, fats this evening, evening fare tomorrow. Radical measures now urgent. The contents of this message confirmed how wrong Paulus's Chief of Staff had been only a week before, when he asserted that the army could hold out till Easter if properly supplied. The message also showed that when the army group had ordered 6th Army to break out of the pocket 1 week previously, this, in view of the approach of 4th Panzer Army, had not only been its first chance of being rescued, but, as could be seen from the state the army was in, its last one too. Otherwise, except for local attacks, there was relative calm on the 6th Army fronts around the end of December and beginning of January. This was either because the enemy wished to munition his artillery for a grand assault, or because he was putting all the forces he could spare into an attempt to destroy 4th Panzer Army and to score the success he was after in the large bend of the Don. On 8th January, General Huber appeared at Army Group headquarters on his way back from seeing Hitler. The latter had had Huber flown out of Stalingrad to Lutzen to brief him on the situation of 6th Army. Huber told me that he had given Hitler a completely unvarnished picture of things in the pocket. This cannot, in fact, have differed in any respect from the one already available to Hitler from the Army Group's daily situation reports, but presumably he was not prepared to credit our own version without further evidence. Nevertheless, it was remarkable how Huber's stay in Lutzen had impressed him, and to what extent he had been influenced by Hitler's display of confidence, genuine or otherwise. Hitler had declared that everything would be done to supply 6th Army for a long time to come, and had drawn attention to the plan for its relief at a later date. With his confidence thus restored, Hube returned into the pocket, only to be flown out again on instructions from Hitler to take over the running of the airlift from outside. Not even he was able to improve it, however, its low efficiency being due to the prevailing weather and the inadequate resources of the Luftwaffe, and not to any shortcomings in the actual organisation. One statement of Huber's which touched me personally concerned a rumour circulating in 6th Army that I had sent them the signal, "Hang on, I'll get you out, Manstein." While I left no stone unturned to extricate 6th Army from Stalingrad, it has never been my custom to promise the troops anything which I was not certain of fulfilling and did not rest with me alone. General Hube, who was a fearless man, had tried to bring home to Hitler how damaging such events as the encirclement of 6th Army must be to his prestige as head of state. By this means he wished to suggest that Hitler should hand over command, at least on the Eastern Front, to a soldier. In view of the fact that Huber had called in to see us on his way to Lutzen, Hitler doubtless supposed that Huber's démarche had been inspired by me. This was in fact not the case. When, after the fall of Stalingrad, I myself proposed a change in the supreme military command to Hitler, he was already forewarned and flatly refused to consider such a thing. Otherwise, especially as he was then still under the impression of his responsibility for the loss of 6th Army, he might have proved more receptive to my ideas. On 9th of January, the enemy called upon 6th Army to capitulate. On Hitler's orders, the demand was rejected. I do not think I can be reproached with ever having taken an uncritical view of Hitler's decisions or actions in the military sphere. Yet I entirely support the decision he made in this instance, for however harsh it may have been from the humanitarian point of view, it was still necessary at the time. I do not propose to deal here with the purely soldierly viewpoint that no army may capitulate, as long as it still has any strength left to fight. To abandon it would mean the very end of soldiering. Until we reach the happy era when states can do without armed might and soldiers no longer exist, this conception of soldierly honour will have to be maintained. Even the apparent hopelessness of a battle that can be avoided by capitulation does not in itself justify a surrender. If every commander-in-chief were to capitulate as soon as he considered his position hopeless, no one would ever win a war. Even in situations apparently quite bereft of hope, it has often been possible to find a way out in the end. From General Paulus's point of view, at all events, it was his soldierly duty to refuse to capitulate. An exception could only have been made if the army had had no further role to play and could serve no useful purpose in prolonging its struggle. And this in turn brings us to the crucial point, which justifies Hitler's order to refuse to capitulate and also barred the army group from intervening in favour of such action at that particular time. No matter how futile Sixth Army's continued resistance might be in the long run, it still had, as long as it could conceivably go on fighting, a decisive role to fulfill in the overall strategic situation. It had to try to tie down the enemy forces opposing it for the longest possible space of time. At the beginning of December, an approximate total of 60 enemy formations, i.e. rifle divisions, armoured and mechanised brigades, etc., had been identified in the siege ring around the army. Some of them had doubtless been temporarily drawn off by the attack of 4th Panzer Army, but new ones had been brought up to replace them. By 19th of January, 90 of the 259 formations reported to be facing Don Army Group were committed around 6th Army. What would have happened if the bulk of these 90 formations had been released through a capitulation of 6th Army on 9th of January is plain enough in the light of what has already been said about the Army Group's position and the consequent threat to the southern wing as a whole. The army was still capable of fighting, even though this was ultimately futile from its own point of view. Yet its ability to hold out was of decisive importance for the situation on the southern wing. Every extra day 6th Army could continue to tie down the enemy forces surrounding it was vital as far as the fate of the entire Eastern Front was concerned. It is idle to point out today that we still lost the war in the end, and that its early termination would have spared us infinite misery. That is merely being wise after the event. In those days it was by no means certain that Germany was bound to lose the war in the military sense. A military stalemate, which might in turn have led to a similar state of affairs in the political field, would have been entirely within the bounds of possibility if the situation on the southern wing of the German armies could in some way have been restored. This, however, depended first and foremost on 6th Army's continuing the struggle and holding down the enemy siege forces for as long as it possessed the slightest capacity to resist. It was the cruel necessity of war which compelled the Supreme Command to demand that one last sacrifice of the brave troops at Stalingrad. The fact that the self-same Supreme Command was responsible for the Army's plight is beside the point in this context. Following 6th Army's refusal to capitulate on 9th January, the Soviet attack, preceded by intensive artillery preparation and supported by a large number of tanks, broke loose on all fronts. The main pressure was directed against the salient which protruded furthest west by Marinovka, and the enemy was able to break in at several points. On 11th of January, the situation became even more critical, and because of the lack of ammunition and fuel, the army could no longer restore it to any appreciable extent. The loss of the positions in the Karpovka Valley, and in particular of the inhabited localities there, deprived the troops on the Western Front of what protection they had hitherto enjoyed against the cold. Furthermore, the state of the weather ruled out any hope of an airlift. This aggravation of 6th Army's plight was made clear in a special report of 12th January, which the Army Group immediately forwarded to OKH. Despite the troops' heroic resistance, the Army stated, the heavy fighting of the last few days has resulted in deep enemy penetrations, which could so far be contained only with difficulty. Reserves are no longer available, nor can any be formed. Heavy weapons now immobilized. Severe losses and inadequate supplies, together with cold, have also considerably reduced troops' powers of resistance. If enemy maintains attacks in present strength, fortress front unlikely to hold more than a few days longer. Resistance will then resolve itself into localized actions. On 12th of January, weather again stopped the airlift and also prevented the Luftwaffe from flying any sorties in support of the Army's hard defensive battles. That evening, General Pickert, the man responsible for controlling the Luftwaffe's side of the airlift, came out of the pocket. He painted a shocking picture of the position and set a limit of 2 to 4 days on the Army's capacity for continued resistance, an estimate that was to prove inaccurate by reason of the bravery and self-sacrifice of the troops. In Pickett's opinion, not even an improvement of the airlift could make much difference from now on, as the Army's resources no longer sufficed to patch up the points where the enemy had broken in. The following information on the tactical situation inside the pocket emerged from a report brought out to us by Pickett from Paulus, who had meanwhile been promoted Colonel General. On the northwestern front, the enemy had attacked with a force of between 10 and 12 divisions. Parts of 3 and 29 motorized infantry divisions had been outflanked from the north and smashed, with the result that it no longer seemed possible to rebuild a defence line here. The 2 gallant divisions had knocked out 100 tanks between them, but the enemy still appeared to have 50 intact. On the southern front of the pocket, in spite of heroic resistance by 297 Infantry Division, the enemy had succeeded in breaking in after 2 days of intensive artillery bombardment. Here, too, there were no more forces available to close the gap. Of over 100 Soviet tanks taking part in this assault, 40 had been knocked out. The eastern front of the pocket was still holding at present, though here, too, heavy enemy pressure was being exerted. On the northeastern front, the enemy had penetrated deeply in several places. 16 Panzer divisions' fighting strength was exhausted. Paulus further stated that the army would stand and fight to the last round. Any reduction in the size of the pocket, as now suggested by Hitler to General Hubie, at the time when it was vitally necessary to accumulate forces for the breakout, Hitler had issued an order expressly forbidding such action. Author would only serve to hasten the collapse, as no heavy weapons could now be moved. Since the airlift had been inadequate all along, no improvement could help matters now. The length of time the army could continue to resist depended entirely on the intensity of the enemy's attacks. That same day the Potomnik airfield was lost. Henceforth the only one left to us in the Stalingrad pocket was that at Gumrak. During the night, however, Paulus reported that there might still be some prospect of continuing to defend the city if several battalions of troops were flown in forthwith with their full scale of weapons. He had already asked us repeatedly to fly in several thousand men to make good his losses, but the army group had been unable to comply because it possessed neither the necessary replacements nor indeed a single uncommitted battalion. Nor would it in any case have acceded to these requests from 6th Army once 4th Panzer Army's rescue drive had become bogged down, if only because there could be no justification for dispatching any reinforcements or replacements into the pocket from then on. It was already quite bad enough to have to fly unit commanders and general staff officers back into the pocket on their return from leave. But apart from the fact that the army urgently needed them, these officers, some of whom bore such old military names as Bismarck and Below, themselves insisted on returning to their troops, thereby proving that the tradition of self-denial and comradeship could withstand the hardest of tests. On 13th of January, Colonel General Paulus's senior aide, Captain Baer, an exemplary young officer who had already won the Knight's Cross, flew out to see us, bringing the Army's war diary with him. He told us how bravely the troops were still fighting and what fortitude all ranks had shown in coming to terms with the cruelty of their fate. Baer carried letters from Paulus and his Chief of Staff to Schultz and myself, letters reflecting the courage, integrity and decency that govern the German soldiers' way of thinking. They fully recognized that the army group had done everything humanly possible to get 6th Army out. On the other hand, of course, one detected their bitterness at the fact that the promises about air supplies had not been kept. All I can say to this is that neither Colonel General Verser Richthofen nor I had ever made such promises. The man responsible for them was Goering. On 16th of January there was again heavy fighting on all the army fronts. For a time it was impossible for any more aircraft to land, following the excessive losses inflicted by the enemy's ground and fighter defences earlier in the day. In the main, it was now only possible to fly supplies in at night or drop them from the air, Inevitably, a considerable volume of stores delivered by the latter method went astray. The same day, Hitler put Field Marshal Milch in charge of the airlift. On 17th January, the army radioed that the Gumrak airfield was usable again, but the Luftwaffe did not agree. The army group, however, insisted that an attempt be made to land there. On 19th of January, I had my first talk with Milch, who had been slightly injured the day before when the car in which he had been coming to see me collided with a railway engine. I impressed on him the urgent need for a radical improvement of the airlift, notwithstanding the hopelessness of Sixth Army's position. Apart from the fact that we owed it to our comrades at Stalingrad to maintain their supplies until the very last hour, I said, the Army was performing a vital operational task in continuing to tie down 90 Soviet formations. In view of the critical situation on the rest of the Army Group's front and its open flank by Army Group B, every extra day we could keep Sixth Army in action might well be of decisive value. Milch promised to release all possible resources from the home front, including the last reserves of transport aircraft and technical personnel for maintenance and repair work. The latter were particularly important now, as the Morosovsky and Tatsinskaya airfields had by this time fallen into enemy hands, and the airlift was having to operate from Novocherkassk and Rostov, and bases even further to the rear. From what Milch told me, it was clear that if he had been called in several weeks earlier, he might have been able to ease matters considerably, since he had access to many resources back at home which were not available to Wiese Richthofen. This meant that Goering was all the more to blame for not having ensured that the resources in question were tapped at the right time. On 24th January, the following communication reached us from the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Zeitzler. The following radio message has been received here. Fortress can be held for only a few days longer. Troops exhausted and weapons immobilized as a result of non-arrival of supplies. Imminent loss of last airfield will reduce supplies to a minimum. No basis left on which to carry out mission to hold Stalingrad. Russians already able to pierce individual fronts, whole stretches of which are being lost through men dying. Heroism of officers and men nevertheless unbroken. In order to use this for final blow, shall give orders just before final break-up for all elements to fight through to southwest in organized groups. Some of these will get through and sow confusion behind Russian lines. Failure to move will mean end of everyone, as prisoners will also die of cold and hunger. Suggest flying out a few men, officers and other ranks as specialists for use in future operations. Appropriate order must be given soon, as landing facilities unlikely to exist much longer. Please detail officers by name, obviously excluding myself. Paulus. The following reply has been sent, message received, identical with recommendation put up by me 4 days ago. On my resubmission, Führer has directed 1. Re-breakout. Führer reserves right of final decision. Please send further signal in case. 2. Re-flying out of personnel. Führer has refused for time being. Please send Zitzewitz here to restate case. I shall take him to see Führer. Zeitzler. As regards Colonel General Paulus's request to have individual members of his army flown out, I would offer the following comment. Seen purely from the viewpoint of military expediency, it would naturally have been desirable to save the highest possible number of essential specialists. Always bearing in mind, of course, that they must be selected quite irrespective of rank. From the humanitarian point of view, it goes without saying that one should try to get every single man out. Yet there was also an aspect of soldierly ethics to consider, the one which dictated that the very first to be flown out should be the wounded. This, in fact, we did succeed in doing on a quite remarkable scale. The evacuation of specialists, however, could only have been achieved at the expense of leaving wounded men behind. Besides, the majority of specialists to be flown out would inevitably have been officers, for the simple reason that an officer's training renders him more important in war than the private soldier, unless the latter happens to have some very special qualification as a technician or scientist. But in a situation like Sixth Army's, the German military code demands that when lives are at stake, the officers must take second place to the men. It was for this reason that the army group made no move to get the Sixth Army commander's proposal accepted by Hitler. As for any attempt to break through the enemy lines in small groups at the last moment, Hitler's final decision never materialized. Nonetheless, the army group did try to create a basis of survival for successful groups of evaders by dropping food at various points behind the enemy front and sending out reconnaissance aircraft in search of them. But none reached the army group front, nor were any sighted by our pilots. At all events, Paulus's message shows that up to the very last those members of Sixth Army who still had any strength left did not lose their will to fight. Indeed, we were aware that some of the younger officers and men, whose resistance was not yet exhausted, were resolved whatever happened to try to fight their way through the enemy's siege ring when the time came. This was why we took the measures described above, fruitless though they proved. On 22nd January, the Russians reached the Gumrak airfield, with the result that supplies could no longer be delivered by landing aircraft. Having reported that he could no longer seal the gap in the front there and that his ammunition and rations were coming to an end, Paulus now sought Hitler's permission to begin surrender negotiations. In this connection, I had a long argument with the latter by telephone. I urged him to authorize a capitulation, my belief being that though every day's reduction of the army's resistance must aggravate the army group's situation as a whole, the time had now come to put an end to this valiant struggle. In bitter fighting, the army had expended its last ounce of strength to hold a far stronger enemy, thereby decisively contributing to the salvation of the Eastern Front that winter. From now on, the army's sufferings would bear no relation to any advantage which could be derived from continuing to tie down the enemy's forces. In a long and violent dispute, Hitler rejected the request made by Paulus and myself and ordered the army to fight on to the end. His grounds for doing so were that every day the enemy's Stalingrad divisions were prevented from being committed elsewhere represented a vital saving. Yet the situation was critical enough now that the Russians had also overrun the Hungarian army on the Don and virtually wiped Army Group B off the map. From Voroshilovgrad on the Donets up as far as Voronezh on the Don, there was a gaping void within which the enemy was advancing in strength and had almost complete freedom of movement. Whether, in this situation, Don Army Group and Army Group A, which was now withdrawing from the Caucasus, could be saved at all seemed more than doubtful. Hitler contended that even if Sixth Army were no longer able to form a coherent front, the fight could still be continued in smaller pockets for some time yet. Finally, he declared that capitulation was futile, as the Russians would never keep any agreements anyway. That the second prediction was correct in essence, if not in the strictly literal sense, is shown by the fact that of the 90,000 prisoners who finally fell into Soviet hands, not more than a few thousand can be alive today. It must be emphasized here, moreover, that the Soviets had intact railways running close up to Stalingrad, and that, given goodwill, it must have been possible for them to feed and evacuate the prisoners. Inevitable though the high loss of life from cold and exhaustion may well have been, the death rate in this case still appears quite excessive. When Hitler turned down my request for Sixth Army's capitulation, I was naturally faced with the personal problem of deciding whether to register my disagreement by resigning command of the army group. It was not the first time that I had contemplated doing so. The problem had particularly oppressed me during those Christmas days of 1942, when I had failed to persuade Hitler to let Sixth Army break out, and I was often to encounter it again in the months ahead. It is, I think, understandable that one should have wished to be released from responsibilities rendered almost unbearable by the interminable, nerve-wracking battles that had to be fought with one's own supreme command before it would accept the need for any urgent military action. The extent to which this wish preoccupied me at that time is apparent from a remark made by my GSOI, the then Colonel Buss, to the Chief Engineer of Sixth Army just after Christmas 1942. According to the latter, Buss's words were, "If I had not kept begging him, Manstein, to stay for the troops' sake, he'd have chucked the job back at Hitler long ago." This impulsive utterance by the man who was then my closest collaborator is the best indication of my attitude and position. But let me make a few general remarks here on the question of a senior commander's resignation in the field. The first point is that a senior commander is no more able to pack up and go home than any other soldier. Hitler was not compelled to accept a resignation, and would hardly have been likely to do so in this case. The soldier in the field is not in the pleasant position of a politician, who is always at liberty to climb off the bandwagon when things go wrong, or the line taken by the government does not suit him. The soldier has to fight where and when he is ordered. There are admittedly cases where a senior commander cannot reconcile it with his responsibilities to carry out an order he has been given. Then, like Seydlitz at the Battle of Zorndorf, he has to say, "After the battle the king may dispose of my head as he will, but during the battle he will kindly allow me to make use of it." No general can vindicate his loss of a battle by claiming that he was compelled, against his better judgment, to execute an order that led to defeat. In this case, the only course open to him is that of disobedience, for which he is answerable with his head. Success will usually decide whether he was right or not. This was my reason on 19th December for giving Sixth Army that order immediately to break out to the southwest, contrary to an express directive from Hitler. The fact that the order did not achieve anything is due to the failure of Sixth Army headquarters to carry it out. It will hardly ever be possible to decide conclusively whether the latter was right to forego this one remaining chance of salvation, as no one can tell whether the breakout would have succeeded or not. On later occasions, too, I acted contrary to Hitler's orders whenever it was absolutely necessary to do so. Success proved me right, and Hitler had to tolerate my disobedience. Unauthorized action was not admissible, however, when it would have landed the adjacent army groups in trouble. This question of resignation has another aspect, however, besides the one mentioned above. I refer to the feeling of responsibility which a senior commander must have towards his soldiers. At the time in question, I had not only Sixth Army to consider. The fate of my entire army group was at stake, as well as that of Army Group A. To throw up my task at this moment, however justifiable the human motives might be in the light of Hitler's attitude over the capitulation of Sixth Army, struck me as a betrayal of those brave troops who were also involved in a life-and-death struggle outside the Stalingrad pocket. The fact that Don Army Group subsequently succeeded in mastering one of the most difficult situations of the war served, in my own opinion, to justify my decision that day, not to resign out of sheer disgust. Just how vital Sixth Army's bitter resistance had been may be gathered from a short sketch of developments in the areas of Don Army Group and Army Groups A and B in January 1943. On 29th December, OKH had finally given in to the insistence of Don Army Group and ordered the withdrawal of Army Group A from the Caucasus, initially by taking its left wing, 1st Panzer Army, back onto the Kuma line Pyatigorsk-Praskovaya, 155 miles southeast of Salsk. Because of the time needed to salvage equipment, the move proceeded extraordinarily slowly, and no forces became free for the time being. By 9th January, the date of Sixth Army's rejection of the surrender call, 1st Panzer Army had still not reached the Kuma line. 4th Panzer Army, whose task was to cover the rear of Army Group A, south of the Don, and simultaneously to keep its communications through Rostov open, had been pushed back to the west through Kotelnikovo after some heavy fighting against a much superior enemy, 3 armies strong, south of the Don. By 9th January, it was fighting hard defensive battles along the Kubale, between the Sal and the Manish, and we could see that the enemy intended to envelop it from both flanks. His 3 Guards Tank Corps, on the Don around Konstantinovka, was swinging southeast and driving on Proletarskaya in the rear of 4th Panzer Army. Similarly, along the Manich, the Soviet 28th Army, newly arrived from the Kalmyk steppes, was trying to execute an outflanking movement to the south. Army Detachment Hollit, after some heavy fighting in the large bend of the Don, had to retire to the Kagalnik sector. Even here, the enemy had already broken into the southern flank of its positions, a small enemy force having crossed the Don northeast of Novocherkassk, the location of Army Group headquarters, on 7th of January. On the northern wing of the army detachment, 7 Panzer Division was trying to delay the enemy's approach to the Donets crossing at Forchstadt by local shock tactics. The crossing at Kamensk could only be covered by emergency units and the few Romanians who had not disappeared from the battlefield. Northwest from this point stretched the enormous gap left by the disintegration of the Italian army. Fighting around Milerovo, for a time almost completely surrounded, was the weak Fretta-Pico battle group belonging to Army Group B. On 24th January, the day 6th Army finally crumbled into 3 tightly packed groups in and around Stalingrad and could no longer tie down any Soviet forces worth mentioning. The situation on the rest of the front was as follows. The northern wing of Army Group A was still around Belaya Glina and, even further south, east of Armavir, which meant that it was 125 miles from Rostov. The withdrawal of the bulk of 1st Panzer Army through Rostov had now been finally approved by OKH. Of Don Army Group, 4th Panzer Army was fighting desperately southeast of Rostov to keep the Don crossing clear for 1st Panzer Army, which I envisaged throwing onto the left wing of my army group to hold the Donets from Voroshilovgrad upwards. Army Detachment Hollet was defending the Donets from its junction with the Don up to a point above Forchstadt. The Fretta-Pico battle group, consisting of 2 dilapidated divisions, was guarding the Donets on both sides of Kamensk. Since 19th of January, in consequence of the disintegration of the Italian and Hungarian armies, the latter too having meanwhile been overrun on the Don, there had been a gap some 200 miles wide from Voroshilovgrad on the Donets to Voronezh on the Don. On 23rd of January, the front as far as Starobielsk had been placed under Don Army Group. Practically the only troops left there were those of 19 Panzer Division, which was already pretty battered after giving up Starobielsk in the face of 3 Soviet Army Corps. When the last resistance of 6th Army ceased on 1st February, the enemy was threatening to cross the Donets in the Voroshilovgrad area with a group of 3 tank, 1 mechanized and 1 rifle corps, and appeared to have thrown another group of 3 or 4 tank corps and 1 rifle corps against the line of the river from Lysychansk to Slaviansk. There would seem to be little point in discussing how the situation would have developed between 9th January and 1st February, or what might have happened subsequently, had not the enemy been tied down so long at Stalingrad by the heroic resistance of 6th Army. Now let us return to the army's final struggle. On 24th January, the front broke down into 3 small pockets, one in the centre of Stalingrad and the other 2 on its northern and southern perimeters. On 31st January, the army commander, meanwhile promoted field marshal, was taken prisoner with his staff. On 1st February, the last of the fighting came to an end when what was left of 11 Corps also surrendered in the north of the city. The struggle of 6th Army was over. Soviet captivity was to finish off a process of decline begun by the utter ruthlessness of the fighting, pitiless hunger, and the icy cold of the Russian steppes. The soldiers who suffered it had surrendered only when their arms were powerless to bear weapons and their hands too frozen to operate them, when the exhaustion of their ammunition left them defenceless in the face of an overwhelming foe. Thanks to the self-sacrifice of the German air crews, however, it had still been possible to evacuate some 30,000 wounded from the pocket. Anyone seeking to fix the responsibility for the tragedy of Stalingrad already has the answer from Hitler's own lips. On 5th February, I was summoned to Supreme Headquarters, all my pleas to Hitler to come and see the situation on our front for himself, or at least to send the Chief of Staff or General Jodl, having failed to move him. Hitler opened the interview with roughly these words: "I alone bear the responsibility for Stalingrad. I could perhaps put some of the blame on Goering by saying that he gave me an incorrect picture of the Luftwaffe's potentialities, but he has been appointed by me as my successor, and as such I cannot charge him with the responsibility for Stalingrad. It was certainly to Hitler's credit that he accepted responsibility unreservedly in this instance and made no attempt whatever to find a scapegoat. On the other hand, we are confronted by his regrettable failure to draw any conclusions for the future from a defeat for which his own errors of leadership were to blame. Yet there is one fact which overshadows the question of responsibility, and all that the ruthlessness of captivity, brainwashing, and justified bitterness may have subsequently done to affect the attitude of many an individual member of the sacrificed army. By their incomparable bravery and devotion to duty, the officers and men of the army raised a memorial to German arms which, though not of stone or bronze, will nonetheless survive the ages. It is an invisible memorial, engraved with the words prefacing this account of the greatest of soldiers' tragedies. The following are the headquarters staffs and formations of 6th Army which perished at Stalingrad: HQ 4, 8 and 11 Corps and HQ 14 Panzer Corps: 44, 71, 76, 79, 94, 113, 295, 297, 305, 371, 376, 384 and 389 Infantry Divisions, 100 Rifle Jaeger Division and 369 Croatian Regiment, 14, 16 and 24 Panzer Divisions, 329 and 60 motorized divisions, as well as numerous Army and Army Group troops, anti-aircraft units, and ground units of the Luftwaffe. Finally, there were 1 Romanian Cavalry Division and 20 Romanian Infantry Division. While the eyes of all Germany were on Stalingrad at the turn of 1942-3, and anxious hearts prayed for the sons who fought there, the southern wing of the Eastern Front was simultaneously the scene of a struggle even greater than that being waged for the lives and freedom of 6th Army's gallant 200,000. The issue was no longer the fate of a single army, but of the entire southern wing of the front and ultimately of all the German armies in the East. This struggle was spared the tragedy of defeat, being ultimately marked, for the last time in World War II, by a brief glimpse of victory. But it embraced, quite apart from its initial association with the trials of 6th Army, such a wealth of unprecedented tensions and well-nigh fatal crises that the campaign may be regarded as one of the most exciting of the war. On the German side, there could no longer be any question of this being one last bid for the palm of final victory. Indeed, thanks to the errors of leadership in the summer and autumn campaigns of 1942, the principal aim, at least to begin with, could only be, in the words of Schlieffen, to bring defeat underfoot. In the face of an enemy whose manifold superiority offered him every chance of victory, the German command had to improvise again and again, and the fighting troops to perform unparalleled feats. Though its end was marked by neither the fanfares of victory nor the muffled drum beats which accompanied 6th Army's death march, this battle still deserves recording. As a withdrawal operation, it must inevitably be devoid of glory. Yet the fact that, far from ending in defeat, it offered the Supreme Command one more chance of achieving at least a military stalemate was possibly something more than an ordinary victory. In order to appreciate the significance of this decisive campaign on the southern wing, and the magnitude of the dangers it involved, we must briefly consider the operational position at its inception. In the winter of 1941-2, Russia's military resources had only sufficed to halt the German attack on Moscow, and with it the German campaign as a whole. Then, in the summer of 1942, the tide had surged eastwards again, finally to ebb on the Volga and in the Caucasus. But now, in the winter of 1942-3, the enemy at last felt strong enough to wrest the initiative from us. The question henceforth was whether that winter would bring the decisive step towards Germany's defeat in the East. Momentous and distressing though the Stalingrad disaster undoubtedly was, it could not, in terms of World War II, effect such a blow on its own, whereas the annihilation of the German army's entire southern wing might well have paved the way to an early victory over Germany. There were 2 reasons why the Soviet High Command could hope to attain this goal in the south of the Eastern Front. One was the extraordinary numerical superiority of the Russian forces. The second was the favourable position it found itself in operationally as a result of the German errors of leadership associated with the name of Stalingrad. It undoubtedly strove after this goal, even if it did not succeed in reaching it. Let me first give a short account of the strategic situation at the start of this winter campaign in South Russia. The German front in November 1942 formed a wide arc curving far out to the east in the area of the Caucasus and eastern Ukraine. The right wing of this arc touched the Black Sea at Novorossiysk and continued along the front of Army Group A, 17th Army and 1st Panzer Army, through the northern Caucasus without actually linking up with the Caspian Sea in the east. The deep open flank of this front, which faced southwards, had only 16 motorized division to cover it in the direction of the lower Volga in the east. The division was located in the Kalmyk steppes east of Yelista. The continuous front of Army Group B only began at a point south of Stalingrad. From Stalingrad, it receded to the Don and then ran along the latter as far as Voronezh. In it were 4th Romanian Army, 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army, 3rd Romanian Army, 1 Italian and 1 Hungarian Army, and then the 2nd German Army. The bulk of the German forces had for months past been bunched around Stalingrad, while the rest of the front, in particular the line of the Don, was entrusted mainly to Allied armies. There were no reserves worth speaking of behind the fronts of either Army Group A or B. The enemy, whose armies formed a Caucasus front, a southwest front, and a Voronezh front, had not only superior forces in the line, but also powerful reserves behind these army groups and the central or Moscow sector of the Eastern Front, as well as in the hinterland. In order to grasp the true danger of this situation and the full extent to which it benefited the enemy, one must try to picture one or two distances of strategic significance. The distance to the Don crossing at Rostov from the Don sector in which 3rd Romanian Army was overrun on 19th November, i.e., opposite and west of the Russians' Don bridgehead at Kremenskaya, as well as from that occupied by the Italian army on each side of Kasanskaya, amounted to only a little more than 185 miles. Through Rostov ran the rear communications not only of the whole of Army Group A, but also of 4th Romanian and 4th Panzer Army. Yet the left wing of Army Group A was at least 375 miles from Rostov, while 4th Panzer Army, in its location south of Stalingrad, was some 250 miles away. Further back, the lines of communication of the German army's southern wing led across the Dnieper crossings of Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk. The connection through the Crimea and across the Straits of Kerch was not a very efficient one. These vital Dnieper crossings in the rear of the German southern wing lay some 440 miles from Stalingrad and more than 560 miles from the left wing of the Caucasus front. On the other hand, they were only about 260 miles from the enemy front on the Don, measuring either from Kasanskaya to Zaporozhye or from Svoboda to Dnepropetrovsk. What this situation could mean in practice I knew only too well from personal experience, having in summer 1941 covered the odd 190 miles from Tilsit to Dvinsk in 4 days with 56 Panzer Corps. I had done so, moreover, against opposition that was certainly tougher than anything the Italian and Hungarian armies could offer on the Don. At that time, the Russians had also had very many more reserves behind their front than were available to us in the winter of 1942. Added to this strategic advantage was the Russians' immense preponderance of numbers. The ratio of forces at the beginning of Don Army Group's struggle has already been shown in the chapter on Stalingrad. How it developed in the course of the winter may be gathered from two figures. In March 1943, the number of divisions at the disposal of Southern, formerly Don Army Group on the 435-mile front from the Sea of Azov to north of Kharkov, was 32. Facing this sector, either in or behind the line, were 341 enemy formations, consisting of rifle divisions, armoured or mechanized brigades, and cavalry divisions. Thus, the conditions under which Don Army Group had to fight were constantly governed by two factors. First, an overwhelming superiority of numbers. Even when the Army Group, augmented by the bulk of 1st Panzer Army and new forces supplied by OKH, consisted of 3 and later 4 German armies, the ratio of German to enemy forces was still 1.7. This allows for the numerical inferiority of certain Russian formations when compared to German divisions. Secondly, there was a strategic danger inherent in the fact that an enemy who was stronger than ourselves, and who for a time enjoyed complete freedom of action following the collapse of the Allied armies, had shorter distances to travel to the lifelines of the German southern wing, Rostov and the Dnieper crossings, than we had. Taken in conjunction with one another, these two factors implied a danger that the southern wing, once cut off from its supplies, would be pushed back against the coast of the Sea of Azov or Black Sea and ultimately destroyed, as the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was just as capable as ever of imposing a blockade. After the destruction of Don Army Group and Army Group A, however, the fate of the entire Eastern Front would have been sealed sooner or later. By virtue of the initial strategic situation outlined above, the whole battle on the southern wing in the winter of 1942-3, and it was destined to be the battle in the east that winter, boiled down to the same question on both sides. Would the Soviets succeed in trapping the German southern wing, thereby accomplishing the decisive step towards their final victory, or would the German command be able to avert such a catastrophe? The operational plan for the Russians to adopt was obvious enough. It had been offered them on a silver platter when the German Supreme Command allowed the front to petrify in the final phase of the summer offensive. Nothing was more natural than that the Soviets should first seize their chance to trap Sixth Army as it lay bunched around Stalingrad. In the further course of operations, the enemy was to be expected to cash in on his knockout successes in the Romanian, Italian and Hungarian sectors, and to try, by striking again and again in ever-increasing strength and scope, to outflank the German southern wing to the north and west. His object had to be to amputate this wing from its communications zones and ultimately to box it in on the seacoast. It was a strategic concept that derived every possible encouragement from the situation in which the German southern wing had been left for far too long by the Supreme Command. On the German side, there was the much harder problem of deciding how to escape from the danger in which we had been landed by our own omissions and the enemy's first unexpected successes on both sides of Stalingrad. In view of the overall strategic situation, however, our Supreme Command should have realized from the first day of the enemy attack how things would develop, and in particular, how dangerously exposed was Army Group A in the Caucasus. Broadly speaking, the German Supreme Command had to choose between two courses. The first would have been to disengage Sixth Army from the Volga immediately after it had begun to be attacked and before it could be tightly surrounded, and then to try to restore the situation in the large bend of the Don with the help of strong reinforcements. At the same time, it would have been necessary to shore up the Allied-occupied Don sectors with German forces. Obviously, however, the Supreme Command neither had the necessary troops available for this solution, nor could it, in view of the low capacity of the few existing railways, have brought them up in time. To take Sixth Army away from Stalingrad was something it could not make up its mind to do. Indeed, not many weeks after the start of the Soviet offensive, it was clear that the army was to be lost for good, and that the best it could do within the framework of the operation as a whole was to tie down the largest possible body of forces for the longest possible period. It was a task which the gallant army fulfilled till the end, and for which it ultimately sacrificed itself. Nevertheless, even after events had taken such an ominous turn as a result of the obstinate way in which Hitler clung to Stalingrad, and after all hope of extricating Sixth Army had proved illusory, there was still a second course open to the Supreme Command. At the cost of surrendering the territory won in the summer campaign, which could not be held anyway, a grave crisis could have been turned into victory. To this end, it would have been necessary to withdraw the forces of Don Army Group and Army Group A from the front's eastward protuberance according to fixed timings, taking them first behind the lower Don or Donets, and subsequently to the lower Dnieper. In the meantime, any forces that could possibly be made available, including those divisions of either army group which became disengaged through the shortening of the front, would have had to be concentrated, let us say, somewhere around Kharkov. On them would have devolved the task of driving into the flank of the enemy as he pursued the retiring army groups or attempted to cut them off from the Dnieper crossings, In other words, the idea would have been to convert a large-scale withdrawal into an envelopment operation, with the aim of pushing our pursuer back against the sea and destroying him there. Don Army Group proposed this solution to OKH when there was no longer any prospect of relieving 6th Army, and as soon as it became plain that Army Group A's position in the Caucasus was untenable and that the enemy breakthrough on the Italian front threatened to cut off the entire southern wing. But Hitler was not the man to embark on a course which initially committed him to relinquish the conquests of summer 1942 and would unquestionably have entailed considerable operational hazards. Such a step was entirely out of keeping with the personality I have already analysed in the chapter on Hitler as a supreme commander. With his lack of experience in operational matters, he may even then have hoped to restore the situation on the southern wing by throwing in the SS Panzer Corps, which was moving up to Kharkov. As far as Don Army Group headquarters was concerned, the first of the above-mentioned courses had already been ruled out before it arrived on the scene, for by that time 6th Army had been completely surrounded. Neither the battered remnants handed over to us as Don Army Group, nor the thin trickle of reinforcements we were getting, could possibly suffice to fight a battle in the large bend of the Don with any prospect of success, even less so after the reinforcements had been held up in Army Group B's sector following the defeat of the Italian army. As for the second course, that of turning a large-scale withdrawal operation into a counterblow against the enemy's northern flank, as he inevitably exposed this in the course of his pursuit, Don Army Group lacked the absolute authority to take it. To do so, we should have required power of command over the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front, and freedom to do what we liked with the OKH reserves. Instead, the Army Group was committed to deal in turn with the tasks which presented themselves in its allotted sphere of command. It had to devise one stopgap after another to meet a danger which arose from the original strategic situation and grew increasingly acute as time went on. The danger that the entire southern wing would be tied off. The first task confronting the Army Group was the relief of 6th Army. Initially, this had to take precedence over all other operational considerations. Once this task had proved insoluble for the reasons already related in the chapter on Stalingrad, the Army Group had to tackle the problem of preventing the even greater catastrophe of the loss of the whole southern wing. As the forces still available as reserves to OKH were not enough to keep the southern wing's lines of communication over the lower Don and Dnieper open, the only course left to us was to gather in the eastern wing of the Army Group and throw the forces thus released over to the western wing. Everything depended then on our always thinking far enough ahead to switch forces from our eastern to our western wing, in time to intercept the enemy's outflanking movements as they gradually extended further and further west. It was a task rendered all the more difficult by the fact that the neighbouring formation in the north, Army Group B, was slowly but surely disappearing from sight as a result of the loss of the Allied armies. On the other hand, it was not possible to shift forces to the western wing in sufficient numbers without calling on forces from Army Group A, which was not under Don Army Group's orders. Though conceived on a larger scale and extending over a longer period, it was the same task that had confronted General Paulus at Stalingrad between 19th and 23rd November. This time, too, it was a matter of moving forces promptly and regardless of local repercussions to the places on which the survival of our rear communications depended, and simultaneously of maintaining our operational mobility. The only difference was that in General Paulus's case, the decision had been compressed into a few days, or perhaps even hours, and that he could count on no reinforcements whatever to begin with. In our own case, however, this idea was to govern our whole approach to operations and involve us in months of conflict with the Supreme Command. In essence, the idea of leapfrogging from east to west to parry the enemy's attempts to tie off the southern wing was an extremely simple one. In war, however, it is so often the simple things which prove hardest to carry out, the real difficulties lying not so much in the taking of a decision as in its unswerving execution. In the present instance, any withdrawal of forces from the eastern wing was bound to create a danger there which no one could be sure of surviving. Above all, If these shifts of forces were to have a timely effect, they must be initiated some time, if not several weeks, before the danger of being cut off had become so acute as to be acknowledged by Hitler. Last but not least, developments in Army Group A's sector, as will be seen later, long prevented us from putting the leapfrog plan into practice. And so, simple and self-evident though it was, this basic approach of ours proved difficult to implement consistently in the face of the increasing gravity of the situation. The same difficulty was experienced in getting it accepted by the Supreme Command, at least in time for it to have any useful effect, since the latter's views were diametrically opposed to our own. Hitler persisted in the principle of holding rigidly onto his gains, whereas we considered operational mobility, at which our operations staffs and fighting troops had the advantage of the enemy, to be the real key to victory. The situation which confronted it at the time of its takeover, combined with the restrictions imposed on it by the Supreme Command and its far-reaching dependence on the actions and attitudes of the neighbouring army groups, led Don Army Group to adopt a system of stopgaps without, at the same time, ever sacrificing the basic formula. In the light of the foregoing, Don, later Southern Army Group's winter campaign of 1942-3, may be broken down into 4 successive phases. The struggle for the relief of 6th Army, on which the Army Group staked everything it could possibly afford. The Army Group's struggle to keep the rear of Army Group A free while it was being disengaged from the Caucasus front. The actual battle to keep open the lines of communication of the German Army's southern wing and to prevent it from being tied off. The final 4th phase, in which the Army Group succeeded, if on a smaller scale than it would have liked, in delivering the counterblow culminating in the Battle of Kharkov. The attempt to relieve 6th Army, or rather to enable it to break out of the Stalingrad pocket, has already been recounted. In an all-out effort to make this attempt succeed, Don Army Group went to the very limits of what could be risked, right up to the time when the fate of 6th Army was sealed, i.e., the end of December 1942, it endeavoured to manage with a minimum of forces in the centre and on the left of the Army Group front, which only amounted to a thin protective screen as it was. Its object was to delay any decisive developments in these sectors until 4th Panzer Army's battle east of the Don had successfully opened up the beleaguered army's way to freedom. Only after all hope of linking up 4th Panzer and 6th Armies had to be abandoned, and the simultaneous defeat of the Italian army had laid bare Don Army Group's western flank and thrown open the enemy's road to Rostov, did the Army Group concede precedence to the problem of maintaining the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front. All that remains for me to do in this context is to give a brief account of how Don Army Group's situation came to deteriorate as a result, on one hand, of 6th Army's decision not to attempt the breakout, and on the other, of the way things developed on the right wing of Army Group B, the Italian army. The difficult position in which 4th Panzer Army had landed on the eastern wing of the Army Group as the enemy threw in increasingly strong forces from the Stalingrad siege front to meet it has already been indicated. In the battles between the Aksai and Kotelnikovo, as well as in the fighting for the latter as a springboard for 4th Panzer Army's relief offensive, 57 Panzer Corps suffered considerable losses after being left alone on the battlefield by the Romanians. 23 Panzer Division, which had been severely weakened before this, was particularly badly hit. The non-appearance of reinforcements from Army Group A made it unlikely that 4th Panzer Army would even hold its own sufficiently to prevent the enemy from swinging strong forces into the rear of 1st Panzer Army. The trend of events on the rest of the Army Group front was not a whit less serious. In what had been the sector of 3rd Romanian Army, the fact that 4th Panzer Army was falling back east of the Don enabled the enemy to cross the ice-covered river around Potemkinskaya, and a little later at Chimlianskaya, and to threaten the Cheer positions in the flank and rear. On this front, General Meath had meanwhile assumed command in place of 3rd Romanian Army headquarters. Since the Russians were coming over the Don from the east and south, we had no choice initially but to order the Meath Group to make a fighting withdrawal behind the Kagalnik. On the left wing of the army group, the position looked even more critical. Admittedly, Army Detachment Hollet had succeeded, notwithstanding the loss of the Romanian divisions, in bringing its forces back southwards from the Upper Chir. Without any justification, however, a newly arrived, recently formed division, which was to have taken over the defence of the army detachment's flank on the Bistraya Gnilaya, gave up the crossing point at Milutinski. This opened the enemy's way into Hollet's flank and also to the important airbase at Morosowski. Far more serious still was the fact that, thanks to the disintegration of the Italian army and the almost complete elimination of the Romanians from the battle, 1 and 2 Romanian Corps on what had been the left wing of Army Detachment Hollet, the enemy was able to make for the Don crossings of Fochstadt, Kamensk and Voroshilovgrad almost unopposed. Only at Milerovo, where the newly formed Freta Pico group on the right wing of Army Group B stood like a solitary island amid the Red Flood, was any resistance being offered. In any case, the enemy was free to wheel east into the rear of Army Detachment Hollet or the Meath Group, or alternatively to keep heading south to Rostov. Don Army Group's situation was serious enough, therefore. Had it been acting quite independently, the only correct way to solve the crisis would have been to put the leapfrog principle into effect forthwith, regardless of any other considerations. 4th Panzer Army could have been pulled back to Rostov in one single movement and thereafter used to fight off the threat to the Army Group's left flank and its communications to the west. The forces of the Meath Group and Army Detachment Hollet, still in action in the large bend of the Don, would have had to come back to the Donets. The objection to this solution lay in the fact that Army Group A was still lodged as firmly as ever in its positions in the Caucasus. To expose its rear by shifting Don Army Group's forces over to the western wing was out of the question. On the contrary, it was Don Army Group's duty not only to cover the rear of Army Group A, but also to keep open its lines of communication through Rostov. For the time being, then, the idea of basing the Army Group's operations on the principle of switching their main effort westwards to balk the enemy's attempts to cut off the whole wing of the German armies could still not take effect. During the first few weeks after the takeover, indeed, the Army Group had deliberately shelved it in the interest of 6th Army. Now, in the second phase, it found itself compelled, in spite of the steadily growing threat to its western flank, to embark on a desperate struggle to keep the rear of Army Group A free. The German Supreme Command should really have been aware from the start that Army Group A could not stay in the Caucasus if the battle to free 6th Army did not immediately succeed. In other words, if there were no clear possibility of somehow establishing a reasonably secure situation within the large bend of the Don. But when the enemy tore a gap on the right wing of Army Group B, which opened his way to Rostov, it should have been palpably evident to anyone that there could no longer be any question of holding the Caucasus front. Unless, of course, Hitler had been able or willing to bring in large bodies of troops from other theatres. As early as 20th December, the day when the flight of 2 Italian divisions had exposed the flank of Army Detachment Hollet and cleared the Russians' way to the Donets crossings, I had pointed out to General Zeitzler that by advancing in the direction of Rostov, the enemy would now have his chance to strike the decisive blow against the whole of the German southern wing. On 24th December, I had again drawn attention to the fact that it was now no longer the fate of Don Army Group alone that was at stake, but of Army Group A as well. I have already mentioned the rejection of my demand for the release of forces from Army Group A to Rostov and 4th Panzer Army. Even if one no longer envisaged renewing the attempt to extend a rescuing hand to 6th Army, it was still in Army Group A's interest that 4th Panzer Army should be reinforced, since its defeat would have given the enemy access to the Army Group's rear. Since Army Group A, quite understandably, did not want to hand any units over, it was the business of the Supreme Command to order the equalization of forces so urgently needed between the 2 army groups. One possible reason for Army Group A's refusal to let us have the divisions we asked for, see the chapter on Stalingrad, may well have been the quite perplexing degree to which its formations and units had been shuffled around and intermingled with one another. Undoubtedly, the disengagement of the larger ones would have been a difficult and at best time-consuming task. This state of affairs was in part the inevitable outcome of a need, in the absence of adequate reserves, to patch up the gaps caused by enemy penetrations. However, it was also due in equal measure to the army groups having for months on end been without a commander of its own to keep things in order. At the best of times, many military commanders are unable to appreciate that units must be left in their normal order of battle if one is to achieve maximum efficiency and preserve maneuverability. When, as in this case, there was no responsible commander whatever for a considerable period, it was hardly surprising if the troops became disorganized. In response to the insistence of Don Army Group, Hitler finally decided on 29th December to order the withdrawal of the eastern and most exposed wing of Army Group A, 1st Panzer Army, to the Kuma sector of Piatigorsk-Praskovaya. Yet he still had no intention of giving up the Caucasus front as a whole. Evidently, he still hoped that by bending back Army Group A's eastern wing to the Kuma, he would be able to pivot it upon the Manich flats, thereby stabilizing the situation between the Manich and Don, and simultaneously keeping the communications of the southern wing open across the lower Dnieper. Thus, the balcony, which had been formed in November by pushing the front out into the Caucasus and up to the Volga, and which had led to the unfavourable situation we were in at present, was not to be eliminated, but merely reduced in size. Where, on the other hand, the forces were to be found to compensate for the loss of the Romanian and Italian armies, and before very long the Hungarian one as well, remained a complete mystery. This, in due course, was what caused the remainder of the Caucasus front to be abandoned. In this second phase of its struggle, Don Army Group was confronted with the following tasks. Instead of acting as the situation really demanded and radically shifting the main point of effort to its western wing to remove the danger of being cut off, the Army Group was compelled, in the face of a mounting crisis, to fight for time. South of the lower Don, it had to protect Army Group A's rear, and at the same time to keep its communications through Rostov open. It was a dual commitment with which the weak forces of 4th Panzer Army were unlikely to cope in view of the wide expanse of territory they had to control between the Caucasus and Don and the strength of the enemy operating there. In the large bend of the Don and forwards of the Donets, it was the job of Army Detachment Hollet to retard the enemy's advance north of the lower Don to such an extent that he could not cut off 4th Panzer Army, and with it Army Group A, by a swift thrust on Rostov from the east. In addition, it had to prevent the enemy from crossing the Donets line Forstadt-Kamensk-Voroshilovgrad, and thereby deny him access to Rostov from the north. Finally, the Army Group had to find ways and means of keeping open the lines of communication running to the lower Dnieper in the west, either with its own resources or else with the assistance of what meagre reserves OKH was able to send us. All this had to be done with troops who had long been subjected to overstrain and were faced by an enemy many times stronger than themselves. Difficult though this task, or series of tasks, was in itself, the paramount danger lay in Army Group A's inability to disengage swiftly from the Caucasus. It was just one more example of the hardening-up process which inevitably sets in whenever mobile operations degenerate into static warfare. If only for the sake of economizing one's forces, immovable weapons have to be dug in and rations and ammunition accumulated. Various facilities are installed to ease the lot of the troops, a particularly important measure when a shortage of reserves prevents them from being taken out to rest. As the horses cannot usually be fed in a static battle zone, they have to be accommodated further back, and this in turn tends to immobilize the fighting units. The state of the roads during a Russian winter, particularly in mountainous country, only added to these difficulties. The upshot is always that troops and formation staffs lose the knack of quickly adapting themselves to the changes of situation which daily occur in a war of movement. Inertia and stagnation gain the upper hand, For every change involves difficult reliefs, movement of forces, inconveniences, and often danger. The inevitable process of accumulating weapons, equipment, and stores of all kinds ties down assets which one feels unable to do without for the rest of the war. The result is that when the command staff in question is faced with the necessity of a major withdrawal, it begins by asking for a long period of grace in which to prepare for the evacuation. It may even reject the idea of a withdrawal out of hand because of the equipment and stores it has come to regard as indispensable. It will be remembered that when the German offensive came to a standstill in 1918, even such a notable commander as Ludendorff could not bring himself, by a boldly conceived withdrawal, to precipitate the war of movement in which Germany's last hope of victory then lay. In the final analysis, he felt unable to write off all the material committed on and behind the German front, or else could not make up his mind to abandon territory which it had cost such sacrifices to win. The situation on Army Group A's front was a similar one. A talk with the Chief of Staff of 1st Panzer Army revealed that this formation could not begin moving back until 2nd January, but after we had helped out with petrol, it was finally able to start on New Year's Day. Even then, Army Group A announced a few days later that 1st Panzer Army would have to fall back onto the Kuma Line sector by sector, in the interest of getting equipment out and evacuating the wounded from the mountain resorts in the Caucasus. For these purposes, it was stated, the Army would require 155 trains, 20 per division, and would not, on account of the low rail capacities, be in a position along the Kuma Line for another 25 days. So although it should have been realised since the end of November that at least the rear of Army Group A would be endangered sooner or later, it was obvious that nothing had been done to prepare for an evacuation. One reason for the omission was undoubtedly that Hitler had forbidden such preparations, or was expected to do so if he learned of them. But an equally important one, I am sure, was the Army Group's lack of a responsible commander in recent months. OKH had been considering the idea of placing Army Group A, which had now been taken over by Colonel General Wyss Kleist, under my command. Generally speaking, it is not a good thing to put an army group or army under a headquarters of equal status. In the present critical situation, however, this would probably have had its advantages, provided, of course, that no strings were attached. Any possibility of interference by Hitler, or of Army Group A's invoking his decisions in opposition to my own, had to be expressly barred. Hitler, however, was unwilling to accept my conditions, and Army Group A consequently remained autonomous. All that Don Army Group could do was to keep on pressing for a speed-up of Army Group A's evacuation measures, with a view to effecting the earliest possible release of the forces whose intervention south of the Don, and later on the western wing of Don Army Group, would be of decisive importance. Everything depended on cutting down this second phase of the winter campaign to the utmost in order to get the position on the German southern wing finally stabilised. The only hope of doing so lay in smashing the enemy forces which were trying to envelop that wing to the west. In the event, it did prove possible to get the deadlines for the Caucasus evacuation considerably curtailed. The hindrances mentioned above were due partly to what appeared to be the inevitable outcome of static warfare conditions and the difficulties encountered in a mountainous theatre, and partly to the Supreme Command's aversion to surrendering anything voluntarily. The fact that they committed Don Army Group to a battle in the Don area lasting from the end of December to early February was bound, in view of what was happening to Army Group B, to intensify the danger that the whole southern wing would be cut off. It would hardly be possible to find a better illustration of Moltke's definition of strategy than in this battle fought by the two armies of Don Army Group. The reason why we succeeded, despite a series of crises, in mastering the tasks already outlined, is that the Army and Army Group staffs adhered firmly to two well-established German principles of leadership. I. Always conduct operations elastically and resourcefully. E. Give every possible scope to the initiative and self-sufficiency of commanders at all levels. Both principles, admittedly, were greatly at variance with Hitler's own way of thinking. While the first will find expression in the account of the battle fought by our two armies, I should like to say a few words on the second one now. It has always been the particular forte of German leadership to grant wide scope to the self-dependence of subordinate commanders, to allot them tasks which leave the method of execution to the discretion of the individual. From time immemorial, certainly since the elder Moltke's day, this principle has distinguished Germany's military leadership from that of other armies. The latter, far from giving the same latitude to subordinate commanders on the tactical plane, have always tended to prescribe, by means of long and detailed directives, the way orders should actually be carried out, or to make tactical action conform to a specific pattern. On the German side, this system was considered a bad one. It would admittedly appear to reduce the risk of failure in the case of a mediocre commander. Yet it only too easily leads to the executants having to act against the exigencies of the local situation. Worst of all, in its preoccupation with security, it waives the opportunity that may occur through the independent action of a subordinate commander in boldly exploiting some favourable situation at a decisive moment. The German method is really rooted in the German character, which, contrary to all the nonsense talked about blind obedience, has a strong streak of individuality and, possibly as part of its Germanic heritage, finds a certain pleasure in taking risks. The granting of such independence to subordinate commanders does, of course, presuppose that all members of the military hierarchy are imbued with certain tactical or operational axioms. Only the school of the German General Staff can, I suppose, be said to have produced such a consistency of outlook. Nevertheless, there are plenty of occasions when the senior commander in the field is faced with the problem of whether or not to take a hand in the operations of the armies or other formations under his command. The more complex the situation and the smaller the forces with which he has to manage, the more often is he tempted to meddle in the business of his subordinates. As far as my own headquarters was concerned, I think I can say that we only intervened in the operations of our armies when it was quite imperative to do so. This was particularly true whenever the army group's operational intentions involved the assumption of responsibilities which it would have been unreasonable to expect the army headquarters in question to accept. On the other hand, we refrained on principle from proffering off-the-record advice, which kills all initiative and hides responsibility. That Hitler showed little understanding for the old established German principle of leadership, and repeatedly sought to meddle in the operations of subordinate headquarters by issuing specific orders of his own has already been mentioned earlier on. Nothing could be done about such orders when they related to the movements of adjacent army groups, or the action to be taken with formations which were still OKH reserves. However, in the many cases when they directed that a particular line was to be held to the last man and the last round, the force of circumstances usually proved stronger in the end. Something which has also been discussed already and was even harder to overcome was Hitler's dilatoriness in the taking of urgently needed decisions. We could not, after all, compel him to give an order. In such cases one had no choice but to report that in default of an OKH directive by such and such a time or such and such a day, we should act at our own discretion. In contrast to the above, I doubt very much whether any of the armies under our command during this or any later campaign ever had reason to complain that we were slow to take decisions. Whenever they put an inquiry or recommendation up to my headquarters, they always received an immediate reply. Only in difficult situations did the army group ever delay a decision for a very limited period, at most for a few hours or until the following morning. On the whole, apart from Stalingrad, the army group always managed in the end to get the requisite action taken in the face of Hitler's interference or procrastination. 4th Panzer Army had two different tasks to fulfill if it was to keep the rear of Army Group A free. It had to prevent the enemy now on its heels from moving in against the rear of 1st Panzer Army until such time as the latter had wheeled back from the Caucasus onto a front facing east. At the same time, it had to ensure that the enemy did not thrust down the lower reaches of the Don to Rostov and cut off both 4th Panzer Army and Army Group A from their communications zones. It was clear that the army had not enough forces to deny the enemy the whole area between the lower course of the Don and the northern spurs of the Caucasus. Since the loss of the Romanians, all it had up around Kotelnikovo was 57 Panzer Corps, consisting only of two seriously weakened divisions, 17 and 23 Panzer. 15 Luftwaffe Field Division was still not ready to go into action, and 16 Motorized Division had still not been relieved at Yelista by forces from Army Group A. All Don Army Group's efforts to get the army reinforced in good time were unavailing. The provision of 3 Panzer Corps by Army Group A had already been turned down by OKH, and now 7 Panzer Division, which Don Army Group had intended to use with 4th Panzer Army, was retained by Hitler at Rostov to cover this crossing point to the north, following the collapse of the Italian army. In essence, this was not a bad idea, except that the infantry division we had requested from Army Group A, i.e. from 17th Army, would have done just as well. But this, as I have said, Hitler had refused to let us have because he feared that its withdrawal from the Novorossiysk sector would cause the Romanian divisions there to give way. An acute threat materialized in the rear of 1st Panzer Army when strong elements of the enemy, which had been following 4th Panzer Army, turned south against 1st Panzer Army just as it was swinging backwards. Although 16 Motorized Division was able to launch a successful attack and bar the way to the enemy from behind the Manich, it was delayed still further from taking part in the struggle of 4th Panzer Army, which it now did not join until the middle of January. A measure which the Army Group had intended taking in its own area to reinforce 4th Panzer Army was thwarted by the enemy. We had envisaged bringing 11 Panzer Division out of the large bend of the Don to join the army. Just when it was about to come over the lower Don, however, the enemy himself crossed the river at 2 different places to drive from the south and southeast into the rear of the Meath Group, which was still holding the lower Chir on a front facing north. To parry this thrust and to enable the Meath Group to swing back into a front facing east behind the Kagalnik, 11 Panzer Division had to be committed north of the Don and was lost to 4th Panzer Army in consequence. In the end, therefore, the only forces to augment the 2 above-named armoured divisions of 57 Panzer Corps were the Viking SS Division, which had already been released earlier by Army Group A, and in mid-January, 16 Motorized Division. By this time, 4th Panzer Army was under pressure through Kotelnikovo from 2 Soviet armies, 2nd Guards and 51st, which between them comprised 1 tank, 3 mechanized, 3 rifle, and 1 cavalry corps. Shortly afterwards, a 3rd Army, 28th, made its appearance further south from the Kalmyk steppes. It could safely be assumed that these 3 armies were bent not merely on tying down 4th Panzer Army from the front, but ultimately on bypassing it to the north and south in order to encircle it completely. If Hitler thought he could order us, in the face of that preponderance of forces and with such an expanse of territory to cover, to make the army hold some line or other, or else to obtain his approval before undertaking any withdrawal, he was seriously mistaken. As an obstacle, a hard and fast line was likely to prove about as effective as a cobweb in 4th Panzer Army's situation. Nonetheless, he still made repeated attempts to restrict our operational freedom by orders of this kind, and stuck to his refusal to reinforce 4th Panzer Army. By 5th January, therefore, I felt I must ask to be relieved of command of Don Army Group, and sent the Chief of the General Staff a teleprinter message which stated inter alia. Should these proposals not be approved, and this headquarters continue to be tied down to the same extent as hitherto, I cannot see that any useful purpose will be served by my continuing as commander of Don Army Group. In the circumstances, it would appear more appropriate to replace me by a sub-directorate of the kind maintained by the Quartermaster General. The Quartermaster General's sub-directorates at army groups were headed by older staff officers who ran their formation's supply and transport services in accordance with direct instructions from the Central Directorate. As things now stood, 4th Panzer Army's object was not to offer inadequate resistance along an overextended line, but to keep its forces close together. Only thus could it offer strong opposition at vital spots or deal the enemy a surprise blow whenever an opportunity presented itself. At times, it would obviously have to denude parts of its area completely and be content to cover others with only a flimsy defence screen. Colonel General Hoth, supported by his admirable Chief of Staff, General Fangor, went about this difficult task with a calm resolution matched only by the versatility of his leadership. He skillfully retarded the progress of the enemy pressing hard on his front without exposing himself to danger by holding any one position too long. Furthermore, by rapidly assembling forces on both his wings, he repeatedly dealt the enemy sharp jabs which foiled every attempt to outflank him. Though unable to let the army have sufficient forces to discharge its difficult task, the Army Group did reserve the right to relieve it of responsibility for at least its most intricate problem by the issue of specific orders. As I have said, 4th Panzer Army actually had to deal with two tasks at once. It had to prevent any of the three enemy armies following it from taking 1st Panzer Army in the rear before the latter had completed its swing back from the Caucasus onto a front facing east, and was ready to look after its own defence. At the same time, it had to counter any attempt by the enemy to drive on Rostov along the lower arm of the Don. If this were successful, the three armies fighting south of the lower Don would be cut off. 4th Panzer Army was only capable of solving one of these tasks at most. Which of them should have priority was a matter that only the Army Group could decide. Admittedly, the threat to Rostov was the greater danger in the long run. Yet should the enemy succeed in encircling 1st Panzer Army as it wheeled back into its new position, there could be no further point even in holding Rostov, and the three German armies south of the Don would be doomed. If, on the other hand, the withdrawal of 1st Panzer Army were successfully accomplished, ways and means would be found to avert a crisis at Rostov. The enemy did try to exploit the two opportunities indicated above. It has already been mentioned that 16 Motorized Division had just been in time to intercept the Soviet elements which had turned off to take 1st Panzer Army in the rear. Yet, with the same operational aim in view, the enemy made repeated attempts to envelop 4th Panzer Army to the south, and thereby to introduce himself between the latter and 1st Panzer Army. At the same time, he endeavoured to drive along the lower Don through Konstantinovka in the direction of Rostov. On 7th of January, a smallish enemy force turned up on the northern bank of the Don some 12 miles from the Army Group headquarters location at Novocherkassk, after the Cossacks and frontier troops guarding that stretch of river had given way. He had to dislodge this domestic invader with a few tanks fetched out of workshops for the purpose. Subsequently, the tank corps of which this enemy force formed part was turned off towards Proletarskaya in the rear of 4th Panzer Army, which meant that we were rid of the threat to Rostov for at least the next few days.